So today we're sitting here talking about the 1st Marine Division. Mostly when you think of D-Day, Conneaut, D-Day, Ohio, you think of D-Day, the European theater. We're here today to talk about the Marines of the Pacific, and mainly the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal. You can see here some of photos from our recent trip. We've actually traveled to the island. Our latest trip was in 2019. We covered Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, which were some of the main islands in the early invasion. And what we're going to be talking about today is probably one of the most important small battles in the Pacific in World War II, and that battle was the Battle of Alligator Creek on August 21st, 1942. This is an actual aerial picture of Alligator Creek. It was actually dubbed the Battle of the Tenaroo, but the Marine maps actually were mislabeled. This was actually the Elu River. The Tenaroo was over here, and Henderson Field would be over here, and the Marines had a defensive perimeter around it. And the Japanese, a force of about 900 men, were trying to get to that airfield and knew that the Americans were along that perimeter. This is an aerial map currently today, and you can see today that the airfield is still there. It's still deemed Henderson Field, and the blue lines represent the Marine lines, and the red line represents the Japanese approach to the airfield. Now you can notice here that these are purposely done because you can actually see the sections of the Marine lines that are missing because they didn't have a full circle around it. But the one thing that they wanted to make sure is that they had this sector covered on the approach to the airfield. Now the two weapons that they used was this here, which is a 1941. This here is representative of a 37mm anti-tank gun. This was a primary gun that was used early in the war, and it fired, these are two of the main rounds that it fired. Fired a high explosive shell, but on August 21st, 1942, this would be the main round of choice for the U.S. Marines. This is a canister round. It's filled with 121 steel pellets and turned this anti-tank gun into a very large shotgun. And this would be very, very effective combined with this weapon over here, which was the 1917 A1 water-cooled machine gun. And the Marines, specifically the 1st Marine Regiment, were armed with the 1917 A1 as well as this gun. And approaching them were 900 Japanese of Colonel Ichiki's task force. And he was pretty cocky. He was so cocky that he only had 900 men. He was going up against about 2,000 men. And he thought to himself, hey, he asked his bosses, once I take care of the Marines and I capture Henderson Field, do I go over and take Tulagi as well? And so his bosses were kind of like, pump your brakes. We're still figuring some things out. And so he decides to attack. And on the night of August 21st, they attack. And talking to vets and reading into the battle, the Japanese, most people that when they think of the Battle of Alligator Creek, they see it on HBO's The Pacific, where the Marines are attacked by the Japanese. But in real life, they didn't know where the Marines were. Most veterans' account says that they had their rifles. These are some representation of Japanese rifles, and the rifles were slung on their back, and they walked almost into the barbed wire. And once they hit the barbed wire, they knew they were in trouble. And one of the more famous stories of the Battle of Alligator Creek centers around 3 Marines, and it focuses around this gun here. First Marine was John Rivers. John Rivers was actually a machine gunner on this. The Japanese actually crossed into their lines. He was actually struck in the head and killed instantly. And unknowing, the Japanese were going up against the Marines were so tough back then. When he was actually killed instantly, his finger actually got stuck on the trigger and still ripped off 200 remaining rounds on the gun. So even as a dead Marine, he was still killing the enemy. His two other teammates was Leroy Diamond, probably one of the more famous Marines, Al Schmid. And a Japanese grenade had actually blinded Al Schmid to the point where he couldn't see, but he had working hands. Now on the other hand, Leroy Diamond, his hands were wounded, but he had good eyes. So he says, get on the gun, you can't see, but I'll direct you, I'll be your eyes. And so as Schmid is on the gun blinded, he's being told to move the gun to traverse, and as the Japanese are coming across the Alligator Creek, he is still able to be effective, and they work as a team. And for all their efforts, all three of them are awarded the Navy Cross for their actions. In the end, mostly all of the Japanese forces are killed. It is after the battle where we start to see the fanaticism of the Japanese. Obviously, the Navy corpsmen are going out to help the wounded Japanese, and they're now trying to kill themselves along with the Marines. And this is absolutely dumbfounding the Marines, because they had never seen a fanatical enemy like this. This is the first land defeat that the Japanese, that happens to them, a major land defeat during World War II. It was the first time that they had really been defeated in force. At the time, the Japanese were an indestructible force. They had taken out the Americans. They had captured territories from the French, all over China, captured a bunch of places. They seemed almost unstoppable, but the 1st Marine Regiment was the first one to stand up to them on Guadalcanal and really start turning that tide of the war. And this is the first battle, and this battle would go on for 6 months at the cost of about 7,000 American lives. And this battle would last from August of 1942 all the way to February of 1943. And it would involve the 1st Marine Division, the 2nd Marine Division, and Army elements, including right here in Ohio, the Ohio National Guard fought on Guadalcanal, some of the remaining stages in the Mount Austin action. So when people think World War II, they immediately think of the M1 Garand and a lot of advanced weapon systems. But when the Marines land on August 7th, 1942 on the island of Guadalcanal, it is a quick reaction force almost. The 1st Marine Division is only months old, and they bring with them a lot of their World War I weaponry. One of them here being the famous BAR. The BAR here is in a World War I configuration, so it doesn't have a lot of the accessories that you would see on a typical World War II, like such as a bipod, a different lower with the magazine housing with the assists there. Also, it has the checkered grips, the high checkered grips, a shorter stock. This is what they would have fielded during World War I. But again, during the re-arsenaling program, the Marines got what they were issued and was sent out. Most of the Marines that landed on Guadalcanal were carrying the 1903 bolt-action rifle, fired the same 30-06 cartridge that the BAR did. There were a few Garands. A lot of people will make the definitive statement that the M1 Garand did not see service on Guadalcanal until the Army landed. But actually the Marines did land, some of their security forces with the 11th Marines, and some of their anti-aircraft security personnel were issued Garands, but about 200 made it on the island, so they were there in the August invasions. These we get quite a few comments with. A lot of people look at these guns and they don't know what they are. These are rising submachine guns. This one here is an M50 rising submachine gun, and this one here is a paratrooper model M55 that had a folding stock. So it was nice that you could just pull the stock, fold it up, and it would be folded up like so. And a lot of paramarines used this early on. Now, the guns themselves were a lot of hand-fitted parts. They weren't very reliable. They were tight tolerances within the gun. So most of the guns were thrown into the local rivers or not used because most of the Marines favored the 1928 Thompson submachine gun. The M1A1 wasn't adopted at this time, so most of the guns in the early invasion would have been using the 1928. And unlike most theaters during the war, a lot of the Marines had the 50-round drums, but it was during this time period they found out how unreliable they were in jungle warfare. And there's not a tight fit on that drum. So when you put 50 rounds of 45 ACP in there and put the top and bottom together, and you're trying to be very tactical in a jungle, and you just hear they realized very early on that, hey, maybe we're not going to use these in a stealth mode. The model 1911 U.S. Army was also used as a sidearm, and also too, unlike in the European theater, the Marines relied heavily on shotguns. This here is a representation of a model 97 trench gun. They wouldn't have been using much of the bayonet, but a lot of your crew served weapons, because of the early Japanese tactics at the time, would have been using the shotgun, because early on they were using the bonsai charges. They were coming in mass, so it was a lot easier for guys to just rack these and let go some double-aught buck shot. But these are some of the weapons here. Obviously, the water-cooled 1917 A1 machine gun was heavily used. One of the biggest misconceptions is when people see these things, they think early war, which they were, but this gun saw action from Guadalcanal all the way. This gun saw action on D-Day as well. The 325th Glider Infantry Regiment actually landed with these guns. These guns were used in mass, both in the Pacific and in the ETO. And then obviously the 37 millimeter anti-tank gun here was used heavily during the Pacific battlefields, Guadalcanal, and all the way through. They learned early on that they were not used so well against German armor, but they fit the mission for the Pacific, that they could bring this on trails, tow them with jeeps, and the Japanese really didn't have a lot of heavy armored vehicles. And so this was used pretty much from Guadalcanal all the way through Okinawa.
So you throw this back, throw the round in, up, fire.
And with that, we'll actually walk you through some of the relics from our trip.
In April 2019, a group of us, Brian, who was just speaking, we went to Guadalcanal and we got to spend a week there. And it's more of a fourth world country where you kind of have to know where you're going. A lot of locals kind of think they own the streets, so you kind of tip them money or whatever. You get around, but it's possible. But the locals there don't really care about the metal like us Americans do. Like, this is gold to us, where to them it's just scrap and they just leave it be. But the cool thing about Guadalcanal is that it hasn't changed since 1942 and 43. You go up to parts of the battlefield and you can still see the foxholes there, and you just jump in and you just pick a foxhole, jump in it, push the grass aside, and a foxhole just tells a story. And that's where you find most of these all these relics were not dug up. These relics were actually just picked up off the ground, and that's what it's all like over in the Pacific Theater. It's just everything laying on top. That's why it's a little more rustic due to the weathering. But you just jump in a foxhole, push the grass away, and you find ration tins, you find shrapnel, you find grenade pins, and you can just kind of put a story together where, you know, the Marines or the Army guys were just sitting there, and you can see what kind of action they're in based off what was around you. So a couple things that I found, all this stuff right here is just like rocks over there, but it's all shrapnel from artillery rounds, mortar rounds. I mean, it's there enough with rocks, so you're going to find just the same amount of shrapnel. These are Japanese rounds, a couple Japanese bullets that were found. We have Japanese dog tags, Japanese buckles. This actually is a boot heel for one of the American boots. Bayonet parts, mortar parts. Kind of like we have a Thompson submachine gun 20 rounder, a Colt 1911 mag, carbine mag, and a BAR mag. this is what kind of I was talking about. This is what I found in one foxhole. I found these are grenade pins, the spoons to the grenades, which are these right here. As you can kind of see, there's the pin with this part that's pulled out right here. That's what's laying across there. You see there. It's hard to tell, but you see all these little pieces coming out. That's what that is shrapnel from the grenade. A lot of things, grenade tins and mortar tins, where they would keep the mortars there. A lot of area we went to, a lot of 81 millimeter mortar firing up there. But like I said, it's everything you found. This was an actually intact coffee can that got crushed on the way home, but another grenade fuse. This was the 16-inch bayonet. As you can see, it just broke off. It probably would come out to here. A lot of barbed wire still everywhere. It's in coils. You can just kind of break it off and take it. Like I said, the locals don't care about any of the relics here. It's scrap metal to them, but we love this stuff. If you're familiar with Edson's Ridge, or more famously known as Bloody Ridge, we're up there with some kind of where Basilon's position was at the very end, but we're kind of in Vandegrift's area where he had his headquarters tent for the battle there. And I went to go snooping around and kicking stuff over. I went to go kick a palm branch over, just to move it to kind of sweep the coral away. And I was like, well, that's a little heavy branch. So I picked the branch up, and this is where I found the BAR bipod, which was one of my coolest finds that I've ever found. Pretty intact. I ended up cleaning this up a bit and taking some of the rust off. But, you know, the Marines there didn't like the BAR, one, because it was heavy, and a lot of times they would just take this off and chuck it and not use it. So this was actually found on the area of Bloody Ridge where they kind of lived and not fought. So it's just they live on one side and fight on the other side. But yeah, it's the relics here, the land here. This is our before and after. If you kind of see, like, we took original photos and then we found the same spots that these photos were mostly taken. You see the rock structure, and there's the same rock structure there. A famous photo of the Marines up in Guadalcanal, we found the exact same ridge. But yeah, like they're just all over the place. You can see it all hasn't really changed, and that's what's cool about Guadalcanal, because there's not really anything there to modernize the country. So it's just really neat to see all this. The beaches where they landed at. This was the famous Alligator Creek that he talked about, with the Japanese coming across the river. And you can see they're just piled up, and it's the same shot just many years later. But you can see the terrain hasn't really changed at all. A couple more. So kind of threw it in. This is an original battle map of Guadalcanal that I had actually reproduced and photographed. But you'll see that the landscape there is just, this doesn't look, it looks like a small hill, but this is actually, it took 2 hours just to get up over this hill on a hike. We went to a lot of places and got our photographs taken. You'll see a lot of caves there that we went in, and I found machine gun parts in one of the caves. And a lot of relics are still there. Tanks are just sitting as they laid, or where you found them. Yeah, it was just one of the best trips I've ever been on, because it's just, everything's as original as it can be.